This is Changing Denver, the show about our city, how we make it, and how it makes us. I'm Paul Caroli. Over the past few weeks, as we've been working through issues related to the safety of the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, those same issues have been at play in the courts. You may have seen the headlines.
Another chapter in the Rocky Flats nuclear site saga. Should it open to the public?
The refuge was supposed to open to the public this summer. But a couple of months back, a coalition of activist groups filed yet another motion for a preliminary injunction. They alleged that the Fish and Wildlife Service hadn't done the proper environmental analysis of its new trail configuration. But the real goal, of course, was to keep the refuge closed. U.S. District Judge Philip Brimmer scheduled a day-long hearing on the case for July 17th, and the coalition's lead counsel, Randy Weiner, put together a slate of experts to testify. When the day of the hearing arrived, I had my usual breakfast, put on a collared shirt, and biked to the Alfred Araj District Courthouse in downtown Denver. I waited in line to go through the metal detector behind Leroy Moore and a few others from the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. And unfortunately, I had to drop off my recorder with the security team. Approximately 50 people were packed into the gallery in courtroom A701 when Brimmer started the proceedings at 9:06 a.m. I didn't understand much of the opening statements, but I could tell that over the years, an intricate legal framework has developed around Rocky Flats. I later read up on this a bit and learned that Brimmer himself has ruled on a number of Rocky Flats-related cases, including one back in 2012 that sanctioned the sale of a swath of refuge land for the construction of the Jefferson Parkway. It was interesting to hear Weiner couch his call for a preliminary injunction in the context of that framework. Legally, achieving the activist goal of keeping the refuge closed and compelling the Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct an environmental analysis are very different things. I think he was trying to demonstrate something called irreparable harm, but I'm not really sure. I'm not a lawyer. The witnesses, on the other hand, them I understood completely. It was the same old story for the most part, from Gail Biggs and Harvey Nichols and Randy Stafford. Only one really stuck out to me. Right before lunch, Weiner called a Dr. Timothy Mousseau to the stand. Mousseau phoned into the courtroom from the East Coast, where he is a professor of biological sciences at the University of South Carolina. Mousseau's expertise is the effects of radioactive contamination on birds, insects, and people. He's worked extensively at Chernobyl and more recently at Fukushima. And he testified that the plutonium and the other lingering contaminants at Rocky Flats do pose a threat to future visitors. I would have liked to talk to Mousseau one-on-one. He seemed to be saying that the risks of visiting Rocky Flats were relatively high. But the way Weiner was questioning him, I'm not that sure what he meant. I can see an interpretation of his testimony that doesn't conflict with what I've read and heard about the health effects of low doses of radiation. But maybe that's just my bias talking. I'd like to talk to Mousseau directly at some point. If I do, I'll probably publish a follow-up. We'll see. Overall, I found the hearing anticlimactic. Brimmer wrapped things up around 3. The activists went down to the street to protest for the cameras, and the local press twisted everything up to push the conflict. Citizen groups allege plutonium remains at former nuclear weapons plant. Yeah, duh. No one disputes that. A month went by as Brimmer deliberated. The new opening date for the refuge, September 15th, was approaching. I knew a ruling had to be coming soon. Then, this past Thursday, I got an email from David Abelson. You may remember him from Chapter 2 of Unclear Danger. He's the executive director of the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council, the main civilian body that oversees issues related to the cleanup, and a keen observer of all Rocky Flats-related legal proceedings.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, David.
How are you?
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're exceptionally clear. How am I?
Also quite good.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it. I really only have 2 questions.
Okay.
David,
What do you think?
I got your email today, and I want you to tell me what happened.
The court had in front of it 2 questions. Number 1, in planning to open the refuge, would the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service be violating the Endangered Species Act? court said no and tossed those claims. Second thing that was in front of the court was a preliminary injunction. Preliminary injunction, in short, would be barring Fish and Wildlife from proceeding with its planning and implementation in order to open the refuge. That preliminary injunction was also denied. In denying the preliminary injunction, the court looked at a 4-part test and focused on one specific question: whether or not there was any imminent risk between the agency action and public health. And for a number of reasons, the court concluded there was no, and there would be no, harm to public health through the planning and opening of the refuge. Those latter claims still remain valid. So the plaintiffs still have an opportunity to continue to press their claims and litigate the issues. But in looking at the issues that they've raised so far, it's a narrow window, a narrow opening they have in order to be able to make their case.
But there's a chance.
There's always a chance.
All right, so David, let's take a step back. This is not the first Rocky Flats related legal proceeding you've paid close attention to.
Correct.
Do you think that this result today is going to have any effect on the dynamics that have ruled this issue for the last 10, 15 years?
No. I think that in terms of public discourse and public dialogue, this ruling has no effect. The dynamic that's played out is that the plaintiffs have been able to gain a lot of a strong voice, a lot of media attention, and that's the court of public opinion. And what might work in a court of a public opinion does not necessarily work in a court of law. And that's what we're seeing so far.
Take a step back. Now take another. Now look to the west and feel the wind coming in off the mountains. And think about all that's come before. How do you feel about Rocky Flats? Pride? Shame? Fear? Love? It's a decision we're all making individually, but collectively our feelings add up to an answer. How can we come to terms with what we've done to this place? Presented in partnership with the Colorado Independent and the Denver Public Library, Changing Denver presents Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats. Chapter 5, Where the Wind Will Blow. This idea of turning an infamous and historic military installation into a wildlife refuge, it has precedent. And you don't even have to leave the Denver metro area to see it.
Today we're at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. It's located just outside of Denver, about 7 miles northeast of Denver, immediately adjacent to Denver International Airport, Denver neighborhoods, and the city of Commerce City.
Here we are, back where this whole series started. Me on a tour of a wildlife refuge with David Lucas of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Since that first tour, I've learned a lot. The history of the former nuclear weapons plant at Rocky Flats, yes, but also boring bureaucratic stuff too, like how this place fits into the broader network of wildlife refuges across the country. I can tell you that Rocky Flats was the 548th piece of land added to the National Wildlife Refuge system, which itself dates back to 1903 and the Teddy Roosevelt administration. Colorado boasts 8 of these refuges. There's Arapahoe in the north, Browns Park on the border with Utah, Monte Vista, Baca, and Alamosa in the south. And here on the Front Range, there's the tiny Two Ponds Refuge in Arvada, Rocky Flats, of course, and finally, Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
It is a 16,000-acre National Wildlife Refuge, with the goal being restoration of short and mixed grass prairie. It's a neat place, a lot of prairie species, but a very similar history to what we talk about when we talk about Rocky Flats. Currently, we're driving through the southern half, which was homesteaded at the time. This was homesteaded through the turn of the century up until 1942, when the United States government asked people to move along so that they could create an army base here in Denver metropolitan area. And this Army base was part of the Chemical Corps, and their function was to make chemical weapons in support of World War II.
The Arsenal is something of a big brother to Rocky Flats. They were both enlisted to serve their country after leaving home. Well, the Homestead era. And things got complicated quick. And when all was said and done, they'd both seen and felt things no piece of land should ever have to feel. Everyone wanted life to go back to the way it was, but they were different, changed in ways no one could quite explain. Rocky Flats is about 10 years behind the Arsenal, but it's on this same post-military track. So if we want a peek at the future of Rocky Flats, we're going to have to go back to the beginning, the birth of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Wildlife Refuge. The year was 1978, and U.S. Representative Pat Schroeder had a problem.
At the time, in 1978, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal had sarin nerve gas, stored on site. Dangerously close, she thought, to the end of the runway at Stapleton International Airport.
This is Kip Sherautis. He was a young staff aide in Schroeder's office at the time, and it fell to him to get the nerve gas far away from Denver.
Then it was left a site without nerve gas, but a highly polluted site, because not only was Army operations taking place there, but the Army had rented space to Shell Chemical at the time, who produced pesticides on site. So you had two organizations polluting the area using what at the time was the common sense disposal, which is just dump it out in the shallow over there in that acreage.
Around this time, in the late 70s, early 80s, the environmentalist movement was finally seeing some results. There were new government programs and funding mechanisms cropping up to address exactly the kind of issue Kip was working on at the Arsenal.
There was now money and an acknowledgement that you have bad places, toxic places that needed cleaning up. So, as time went on, in comes Superfund, but kind of miraculously, as this drama goes, so did fly-in bald eagles.
Bald eagles were an endangered species at the time, and when they took roost in the Arsenal's cottonwood trees in the mid-1980s, the Fish and Wildlife Service sent a team to take a look.
So in comes that federal agency to protect the bald eagles. Everyone began the realization that, oh my God, there is this buffer land full of a thriving wildlife habitat. What can we do with that?
So at this point, there was money, there were stakeholders, and there was a strong desire for a cleanup.
Well, that begs the question, well, what do you want to do with the land once you clean it up? And then you have this kind of chasing tail exercise.
The EPA, U.S. Army, Shell, and the state of Colorado all went to court to fight over who would pay for the Superfund cleanup, how long it would take, and how it would impact local communities. It was a big, complicated mess.
There needed to be some kind of policy that kicked the whole question out of court, but then set up some kind of a land use policy. It's not Congress's role to set local land use policy. But in a situation where you had Superfund and wildlife refuges and endangered species, there was some kind of federal responsibility to set some kind of a land use.
Okay, so there's this big problem, and there's no easy solution. Get ready to hear a story about the value of all things, lobbyists.
One day at my desk, I open up a letter from the Colorado chapter of the National Wildlife Federation. In it, it said, "Dear Congresswoman Schroeder, attached is draft legislation that we think would help the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. It calls to make the Arsenal a wildlife refuge." And it took me a nanosecond to consider that this was the magic answer.
How clean is clean? Clean enough for a wildlife refuge. It was the right idea at the right time, and it passed into federal law with bipartisan support in 1992. This brings us back to Rocky Flats. Remember, back in the early 90s, production had stopped, and the cleanup process was just getting started. The EPA, the state of Colorado, and the Department of Energy were starting to ask the same questions that were asked about the Arsenal 10 years prior. What's out there? How bad is it? Who's going to pay for it?
As the issue continued on, everybody started looking towards the future and, what are we going to do next?
This is Mike Bennett. He was the chief of staff in then Senator Wayne Allard's office.
I had been with Mr. Allard since 1991, and one of the first legislative projects we did was the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Refuge. And so we all started looking around for a long-term way to manage the facility and the land. And so we kind of took that template and started talking internally. Can that be a long-term solution also for land use for Rocky Flats?
We know the story from here. Allard worked with then Representative Mark Udall to pass the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge Act of 2001. And the buffer zone around the former plant site was ultimately transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2007. So if the question is how Rocky Flats, a former nuclear weapons production facility, might actually function as a wildlife refuge, the answer is probably a lot like the Rocky Mountain Arsenal today.
Long-term vision.
I see some bison.
Yeah, I'm stopping here because
Sorry.
There's a bison herd here on our right. This is the main herd here at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. There's about 150 bison here. They're our biggest habitat management tool that we've got out here. They do all the work. They eat about 20 to 40 pounds of grass a day. Pretty substantial. Our goal with bison is we are trying to maintain the historic genes associated with the original American Plains bisons that existed here. Similar story to what we'll talk about a lot. We almost made this animal extinct. So,
approximately 35,000 people visit the Rocky Mountain Arsenal each month for a chance to see bald eagles, bison, and the extremely endangered black-footed ferret. They come from all over the world to experience this unique array of flora and fauna, but also to witness the results of a massive land reclamation project so close to a major city. To many, the Arsenal is a shining example of how to make something ugly and dangerous into something beautiful. To come to terms with a terrible tragedy. To remember with respect. Kip, Mike, and I suspect many of the people they worked with on these projects look at Rocky Flats and the Arsenal with pride. They made sacrifices to work in government, to fight for what they believed in. Now, 20 years after those fights, these refuges stand as living monuments to their success. It's no wonder that both Kip and Mike joined the board of an organization called the Friends of the Front Range Wildlife Refuges. It's a small nonprofit dedicated to supporting the Fish and Wildlife Service in preserving these refuges as assets for our community. That means recruiting volunteers to work at the Arsenal's Visitor Center, fundraising for outreach efforts, and organizing school field trips to the Arsenal.
We not only invite schools to come out, but we also pay for the school buses if they can't afford them. And the Rocky Mountain Arsenal has diverse neighborhoods around them, Title I schools and schools that simply can't afford the school bus. We invite the school districts and school groups, church groups, kid groups out to the Arsenal as well.
They were hoping to replicate this arrangement at Rocky Flats, but as we all know well at this point, the campaign to stop the Rocky Flats Refuge from opening has had some success. Last year, Kip and the Friends group watched quietly from the sidelines as 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 school boards preemptively banned field trips. In my reporting, I learned that very few, if any, of the people making those decisions consulted anyone other than the activists themselves. They didn't talk to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, let alone any independent experts.
That's when I got the notion that, oh my God, someone's got to say something to the contrary. I'm a political animal, so I see the political and communications challenges. And I just think common sense and good communication can help to make Rocky Flats a wonderful refuge in and of itself.
For Kip, this was more than just an attack on the Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge and its potential benefits for the community. It was personal. His legacy was at stake.
I would go to David and say, "Hey, David, let us tell the story. You are a federal person. You can only say so much. We're a nonprofit. We have far more flexibility to talk."
Back in January of this year, Kip reached out to the Jefferson County School District. He caught wind that they were considering a field trip ban, so he invited them and a few CDPHE officials on a tour of the refuge. He also analyzed the activist rhetoric and devised a strategy. They say that there are tons of other places in Colorado where school children can go and experience the outdoors. Well, Kip thought to himself, is that true? Is Rocky Flats just another patch of land?
And the genesis of this was just one weekend on the website of Jefferson County School District. It has their K through P through 12 curriculum on the website, organized into blocks of day during the year for each year. So I just went through it and identified different kind of curriculum units that I thought might apply to Rocky Flats.
Kip sent me a copy of the document he prepared for the Jeffco officials. It reads as follows.
The Friends of the Front Range Wildlife Refuges identified over 30 curriculum blocks, both core and elective, where Rocky Flats can apply. The examples below suggest significant learning opportunities related to Rocky Flats in the classroom, on field trips, or through some other approach. Grade 1, Science. What on earth? Geography. A world of boundaries. Grade 2, Science. Today's weather.
Weather would mean that the class can put up a weather station at Rocky Flats, on Rocky Flats, by the visitor center, and each day record the temperature and the wind, and that's where you learn about, when storms come in, the temperature will do this and the barometric pressure will do that. So it's using Rocky Flats as kind of a weather station.
His suggestions ran the gamut, from the histories of the homesteading era in Colorado and the Cold War, all the way up to natural resource management and even civics. He took all those suggestions, and alongside the team from the CDPHE, made the case for not just allowing field trips to Rocky Flats, but encouraging them. I first spoke to Kip about a week after that meeting. He was in good spirits. We spoke again about 2 weeks later, in mid-February.
So that's what we had discussed last time, and I guess I just want to ask you what happened.
Well, what happened, the superintendent, I thought, made a wise and thoughtful decision. He weighed both sides about field trips. He did come out with his team and asked us the questions he's been getting asked, and did look around and did see the value and did appreciate the curriculum ideas.
Superintendent Jason Glass didn't outright ban field trips to Rocky Flats, as has been widely reported. He said the Jeffco schools were not currently sending any field trips to Rocky Flats, had no plans to do so, and that any proposals to organize such a field trip would have to be pre-approved from his office.
Yeah, he's getting out in front of it. He's a politician too, so I respect him for weighing all sides. At least he brought his team out to take a tour of the place and ask state health people, the questions they're getting asked. So I give him credit for all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not every.
I think Kip was disappointed, and I don't blame him.
So what's next for you? Are you going to keep going to these school districts?
What's next for me is getting ready for the Rocky Mountain Arsenal history series.
Right.
In whatever it is, March 15th. So on this score, I will be sort of organizing that. I suspect we will get a good audience out of it. And again, you're all invited, and I did check with them.
And now, a quick break and a word from one of the other members of the Denver Podcast Network.
Every week, Denver's own Real Nerds podcast sees a new movie and we podcast our experience to the world.
I think sometimes we're funny.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm talking, not when you're talking, not when you're talking.
Oh,
you know, it might help if you told them that we're on iTunes or on Stitcher so they could find a place there you can actually listen to us.
Oh, okay, Brad. We're also on Twitter at Real Nerds, and we have an Instagram account. Boom. Commercial, Brad. Cut, paste, upload. We like to have fun.
Sure. I like fun.
James, you're very bad at improv. RealNerdsPodcast.com.
In the absence of any organized opposition, the activists continued their campaign. A couple of months after I spoke with Kip, a cadre of them attended a meeting of the Denver School Board on Thursday, April 26th.
Thank you. Our next topic is requests to not have field trips to the wildlife refuge at Rocky Flats.
Across a sea of folding chairs, underneath a basketball hoop, I watched as one by one these activists got up and made the same arguments I'd heard 100 times. There is plutonium on the refuge. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Children are particularly susceptible to plutonium. But then, a pleasant surprise.
Hello. My name is Judy Danielson. I'm a retired physical therapist and was an organizer with the American Friends Service Committee, a peace and justice organization during the 70s, educating the community about the global threat and also the local hazard posed by the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant.
Judy Danielson, the woman who helped start the whole activist movement in the first place back in the early 70s. When I interviewed her a few weeks prior, she told me that she wasn't really involved with Rocky Flats anymore. I think she was still disappointed that Daniel Ellsberg and his more confrontational style took over the campaign in the late 70s. I disagree with her about the safety of the refuge, but it was really nice to see her back.
As a mother and a grandmother, I am morally and deeply opposed. I have come to ask that you draft and pass a resolution.
I wasn't expecting a decision from the school board that night, so I left early. But to my surprise, when I woke up on Monday morning, there it was on the front page of the Denver Post. Quote, "Nearly 300,000 Colorado public school students now barred from making field trips to Rocky Flats. Denver Public Schools' latest and biggest district to ban school visits to soon-to-open wildlife refuge." The vote was unanimous, but not surprising. Denver was the 7th district to ban field trips, after all. But for me, it was especially frustrating. I live in Denver. This is my school board. I felt it in a way I hadn't before. So I emailed a few members of the board to ask for an interview, and they directed me to their colleague, Lisa Flores. She's represented Denver's North Side on the school board since 2015.
You can. Let me see. I'm getting these texts as we're talking, so I'm going to put the Do Not Disturb on.
Okay.
So that it doesn't do that.
I covered a school board race for Changing Denver last year, but I didn't know anything about Lisa or her politics going into this call.
Okay. Well, it's great to meet you, Lisa.
Thank you, Paul. Good to meet you, too.
So tell me how Rocky Flats came up in the course of the school board's work.
I think that I can't be certain when we actually began to hear from constituents. However, I think we first started having folks show up at public comment in January. And in addition to...
Lisa told me that the board members talked about the issue a few times internally.
And at this last board meeting, it felt time to take action in kind of a common sense way.
A common sense way, what do you mean?
Well, I would say that, plutonium is like nothing else. In terms of the contamination that takes place, plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. And what that means is that...
In case this all doesn't sound immediately familiar, what she's repeating here are the activists' main talking points. They've been saying this kind of stuff for years now.
So, I don't know. I guess I'm saying, did you consult experts and scientists who had not come to you?
Well, in full disclosure, I live with a engineer with 2 degrees from Colorado School of Mines. So you don't want to know what our pillow talk looks like. It's very geeky in nature.
I mean, if it has, honestly, to be fair, I mean, if the contents of your pillow talk have bearing on the public health, I think it would be worthwhile to share some of that, because these, like this, what you've said about like a single particle of plutonium and the half-life, like those things have been disputed by independent scientists who have not been related to the Rocky Flats issue for a long time.
I think, so, I was a little tongue-in-cheek when I had said that, but I think part of it is that it's basic physics in terms of how that half-life plays out. And again, plutonium is like nothing else. So.
Okay.
Lisa's been around this area for a long time. She has a better than average understanding of the history of the site. But the details, the really important stuff that should have informed a big decision like this, she's a little shaky on those.
Well, it's interesting, too. Like field trips there's no ban on field trips to Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So this isn't necessarily an issue about sites in Colorado that once, were production sites for weapons of mass destruction, right? But the chemicals that, and again, there was a huge cleanup at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, but the contamination that would potentially take place is that you actually have to inject that toxicity, right? And with Rocky Mountain Flats, it's about plutonium, so it's airborne contamination. And again, the toxicity level is extreme. So this is in a whole separate category. And again, I think we all, and as a board, felt that the concerns of our constituents were legitimate and that it was fair for us to exercise with caution.
Mm-hmm. So you said just a second ago that the potential harm of the contaminants at Rocky Mountain Arsenal was from ingestion. And then you said that the potential harm from plutonium is airborne. Now, what do you mean by airborne? Because I've been told that plutonium is an alpha emitter and it's only dangerous when you ingest it.
You don't have to ingest plutonium, you just need to be near it.
Okay. Okay. Well, Lisa, I thank you so much for taking the time. This was really, I really appreciate it.
And I
want to give Lisa a little credit here. She's responding to the desires of her constituents, and that feels all too rare in politics these days. But don't we want our elected officials to be leaders? Like Jason Glass. He consulted all sides at least. What does it say about all these other school boards that they didn't talk to anyone other than the activists before they made these big decisions? I get that it seems like common sense, that any inkling of danger demands a response when children are around, but these decisions have huge implications. Lisa Flores herself cited the Jeffco field trip ban as a precedent for her own decision. Now she's provided cover for politicians in even higher office to do the same. And speaking of higher office, will Rocky Flats be an issue in the governor's race this year? I don't know, but I have a guess where progressive Jared Polis from Progressive Boulder would come down on the issue. How could he alienate such a big vocal block of his base? The Polis campaign has not responded to my interview requests thus far, but I did find a video of him questioning the director of Fish and Wildlife in Congress back in 2015.
Director Ash, I want to thank you for being here this morning. I was thrilled to see the details in your U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
This hearing took place a few months after David Lucas and the Fish and Wildlife Service succumbed to public pressure and canceled a controlled burn at Rocky Flats.
Through a prescribed burn. And I was very happy that earlier this year there was a prescribed burn taken off the table for this year. That's an issue that will likely be revisited. I want to make clear how troubling the idea of the burn plan is to my constituents, from the Boulder County Commissioners to the Rocky Flats Stewardship to the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, to many constituents who wrote in their own capacity. Our local voices were united against the grave concern from the impacts of such a burn, not only on the landscape of the refuge itself, but on families that live just south of it, and on plants and animals that call it home. Unfortunately,
seriously, if anyone out there knows someone working on the Polis campaign, put in a good word for your friendly neighborhood podcast. I'm not expecting much, though. I mean, maybe he's staying quiet for a reason. What's going to happen at Rocky Flats? David Lucas and his team at Fish and Wildlife are preparing to open the refuge on September 15th. And even with the recent injunction dismissed, the activists are planning their next protests and further legal action. Maybe it opens, maybe it doesn't. But what about 10 years from now? I don't think Rocky Flats will ever operate like the Arsenal does. I'm not sure it should. It has its own unique history and its own unique array of lingering contaminants. I guess I'm most interested in the activists. I've come to respect and like a great many of them, even now that they're not so happy with me. What's going to happen to this movement when the lifers are gone? People like Harvey Nichols, Gail Biggs, Ann Fennerty, Bonnie Graham Reed, Marion Whitney, and especially Leroy Moore.
Do you think that the movement could continue without you?
Sure.
Did you ever think about that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm 86 years old, and I'm not going to be here forever. I had two good friends that died in the last year. One of these days, I'll be the one that dies, and other people will have to continue. I have. If you look on our website, you'll see that I have written an enormous amount of stuff, and now I'm adding. I'm doing a long history of Rocky Flats, which is called Plutonium and People Don't Mix, and it's divided into many parts, and it's kind of an open document in which new things are being added as things develop. So talking to you reminds me that I should go back to it. I probably things have happened in the last couple of years that aren't recorded there and need to be.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's quite a story, I think, and a rather moving story, and it's about people's lives.
I've seen a few young people here and there step forward, and I hope others follow. Rocky Flats needs a community that cares. It needs hikers to tend the new trails. It needs birdwatchers to help track migrations. It needs historians to uncover new truths about our sordid nuclear history. And yes, it even needs concerned citizens. People who come out to the meetings, engage in the details, and push for change where change is needed. Like the water, for example. The DOE has reported exceedances of its limits for contamination in 2 creeks running through the central operable unit.
It seems like it covers most of those things kind of already.
The water, I think, is the one here, because in the outdoors industry, one of the biggest growing product segments is these like personal filtration devices. And
I think that's a good question. We'll have to. We may want to talk about it.
I don't know. It seems like a possibility.
It seems like a possibility. Again, I don't. The vast majority where the public is, I don't think it's probably even an issue beyond why you wouldn't want to drink water to begin with. You're probably more likely to get sick from Giardia.
David and I covered a lot of ground on that tour of the arsenal. I was better equipped this time, and we delved into some really murky quandaries, like risk communication. How could Fish and Wildlife possibly distill all this information, all these years of history and controversy, into a pamphlet to put in the visitor center or a sign at a trailhead? The signs in particular are a perfect microcosm of this entire story. In the last few years, I heard complaints over and over from the activists. They said that hikers and bikers will not understand the risks of entering the refuge when and if it opens. They ask, shouldn't people be able to make informed choices? But as with so many of their questions, they weren't really looking for an answer. Would it be within Fish and Wildlife's power to put up signage talking about the history of the site, the current status of what's out there?
Yeah, I think you hit a great point here. This is another one of those funny parts about dealing with this particular group of activists is they know darn well that we agreed in 2005 to put up signs. But they continue to tell everybody that we should. Okay. But we already did agree in our 2005 plan to put up signs at every entrance point that describe the history, the cleanup, and any access restrictions that may exist on the site.
And those restrictions, there are no access restrictions, right?
Well, there'll be normal refuge regulations. I think, on trail use will be a big thing. And I think we will tell people to stay where they're supposed to stay.
A few hours after I got home from that tour of the arsenal, I got an email from David. He knew I was interested in the signs, and he wrote something like, "Here's the draft text we're working on. It's not final yet. We're still working on some edits." The email had a single attachment, a PDF. It looked as if David had unstuck a printed out copy of the text from a corkboard and hastily scanned it, page by page, into his computer moments before pressing send. I was grateful to receive it, and I'm pleased to share it with you now. Quote, "What happened here? The land you are about to enter, Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, is a historic Cold War site. Refuge lands are a part of the buffer zone of the former Rocky Flats plant that operated from 1951 until 1989, when it was closed. For nearly 4 decades, thousands of women and men worked here, building nuclear components for the United States deterrent weapons throughout the Cold War period. Weapons components production at the plant involved plutonium and other radioactive and hazardous materials. The work was dangerous and secret. Over the course of decades, there were accidents. Some of these accidents and some of the waste handling practices of the early decades resulted in releases of plutonium and other contaminants into the environment. Beginning in 1995, many of the same Cold War veterans who had built weapons components at Rocky Flats assisted with an unprecedented and enormously complex cleanup project to remediate contaminated buildings and soil on the site. They accomplished that job in 2005, leaving the land as an asset for future generations of Americans. The Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge Act, passed by Congress in 2001, designated a portion of these lands as a national wildlife refuge. Is there residual contamination? An extensive evaluation of contamination at Rocky Flats was conducted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Colorado Department of Public Health. The levels of contamination are low, meet conservative state and federal cleanup standards, and are similar to... Changing Denver is a proud member of the Denver Podcast Network. In the shadow of the mountains,
we speak.
Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats, was produced in partnership with the Colorado Independent and the Denver Public Library. Thanks so much to everyone involved in this project from the beginning, but especially to our super agent backers, Jason Peterson, Joel Noble, Mark Roxwald, Mark Maringer, Jeff Reisig, David C. Shelton, one anonymous donor, and also thanks to my wife, Megan Ariano. Megan, do you want to go on a hike in Rocky Flats?
I never want to go on a hike.
Thanks this time to Kip Sharautis, Mike Bennett, David Lucas, and Lisa Flores. Our theme song is Minnow by Felix Fast4ward. The rest of the music in this episode is by Aethernaut, Lee Rosevere, and Chris Zabriskie. Changing Denver will almost certainly return in some form. Keep up with the show at Changing Denver on Twitter. I've been your host, Paul Caroli. Still have questions? For more information about the history, contamination, cleanup, or site safety issues at Rocky Flats, please call the EPA at 303-312-6312, the CDPHE at 303-692-3300, or the DOE's Office of Legacy Management at 866-422-0759. For more information about the Refuge, contact the Fish and Wildlife Service at 303-289-0232. Tell them Changing Denver sent you.